guys. I'm Phoebe Velez. I am a graduate student in the advertising program at the Newhouse School, and I'd just like to welcome everybody here first. Hi. So first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. We are excited to host today's Leaders in Communications conversation about recognizing great stories with Stacey Mindich. Stacey Mindich, class of '86, is a Tony, Grammy, and Olivier Award-winning theatrical producer. As the lead producer of the award-winning Dear Evan Hansen, Stacey nurtured the groundbreaking original musical through an 8-year development that ultimately broke every box office record, won 6 Tony Awards, 3 Oliviers, a Grammy, and has had productions on Broadway, across the country, and worldwide. Beyond Dear Evan Hansen, Stacey Mindich Productions has produced more than 20 plays and musicals on and off Broadway. Prior to her career in theater, Stacey was a journalist and editor at Town & Country, Newsday, The New York Times, Savvy Magazine, Self, and Departures. She graduated from the Newhouse School in 1986 with a degree in magazine journalism. Sorry guys, her resume's long. Leaders in Communications is a monthly speaker series that brings media leaders, influencers, and newsmakers to the Newhouse School for candid and insightful conversations, with a special emphasis on current trends and challenges. The series helps students keep a pace of a quickly changing communications industry and provides them with a connection to the professions they will eventually lead. The series is supported by the Hearst Speakers Fund. Today's conversation will be moderated by Aileen Gallagher, chair of the M&D department at the Newhouse School. Please join me in giving Stacey and Aileen the warmest welcome.
Thank you, Phoebe. This is a really exciting opportunity for us. What is not included on that resume, but is very important to us here at the Newhouse School. So I'm the chair of the Magazine, News, and Digital Journalism program, which is what the magazine program is part of now. And Stacey was a magazine alumna. And for years, Stacey has made it possible for a group of students to go visit New York City for their benchmark trip as seniors and grad students, and go meet alumni who are working in industry and get a really important and intimate introduction to the industry that she loves and the city that she loves. And those trips have been really transformative for our students and have often led to some jobs and some internships for sure, but give students a great sense of confidence when they're going out into industry. So I just want to personally thank you on behalf of the department and all the M&D students for your support of the Glavin trip every year. Yeah. Thank you so much. So you worked in journalism before working in Broadway, and I'm interested in how we kind of went over, Stacey was telling us a story before, during lunch, and about the origin story of Dear Evan Hansen. I heard you say so many things that really resonated with me as a journalist in terms of what you were doing. So could you kind of share what you think, how you think your career as a journalist prepared you for a career as a Broadway producer?
Yes, is this on? Yes, it is on.
Does it sound mic'd out there, everybody?
Yeah. Okay, good.
Right, there's a lot of no's and then some yeses.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's actually been more of a joy than I thought it would be, just to be with all of you and to be on campus again. You know, I have a great office filled with lots of wonderful young people. And the thing I started talking about almost immediately was my journalism career when I got to theater, because it really, what you learn here are the skills that you take with you in any creative medium. And my terms might have not been so correct on Broadway when I told a a theater writer to run it through the typewriter again. It didn't, go over as well as it might have as an editor, but the concepts are really the same. I mean, as a magazine editor, my job was to find a story that would, continue to fulfill the magazine's mission and keep the readership engaged. And that story had to be surrounded by an illustration or a photo, and the story had to be sold in a variety of ways. And in theater, it was the exact same job, only a lot more expensive and dramatic. And there were songs. But at the heart of it, it's about finding a story that everyone wants to hear. And so you might, as an editor, assign a story and then work with the art department to find the way to make it come alive graphically. But in theater, you find a story and you hire the writers, you hire the director, you hire the set designers, but it's all about the same thing. And so I found that my skills were almost too easily transferable to Broadway, and that in some ways, and what I was telling the theater kids this morning was that it's good to have another career before being a producer. It's good to learn a lot of other things, because producing is sort of the coming together of a lot of your skills, and you need to go develop those first.
And one of the things that you do as a producer is pitch, and you're pitching to funders and other people. So we certainly talk a lot about pitching, and pitching is often really difficult for students, and difficult, I think it's a challenge for all journalists really. So when you think about how you're gonna make a pitch to whoever you're pitching, what are the important things that you really wanna be able to get across to them in that pitch?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing is that it's the story itself. I mean, if you have a good story, then it's gonna happen one way or another.
Your mic's not working, sorry.
My mic's not.
It's a little loud.
Working now? My kids say I'm really loud, but I'm not really. A good story is a good story is a good story. One way or another, it's gonna find its way to life. So I find, that's the most important thing. When I was raising the capitalization for Dear Evan Hansen, just telling the story of the composers and their idea really was kind of like fire. But it's a little easier with theater to pitch because you could play a song, it's not just about words. I think the other thing that I've found to be very important is taking myself out of it, because the story isn't about me, whether I'm writing it or I'm producing it. And I think when people feel that it's not about self-interest, but it's about the actual telling of a story that could be important, then it resonates more. So I guess translating that to journalism is, if you're writing about something you really care about and you think will be powerful, putting it out into the world is important to you and will be to others, then that's the focus of the pitch, more so than I am writing this story. I learned really early to take the I am, I want, I do, out of it as much as possible.
And it's okay, I'll use my shouty teacher voice. One of the things I thought was so interesting about you talking about that too is these editorial kind of skills that we think about you are working with composers and writers who are always vulnerable people, and you are coaching them and being really supportive of them, that you are thinking so particularly about your audience and how to reach your audience. And I thought the audience piece of the Dear Evan Hansen origin story was really interesting. If you could share that slice of it. You were talking about that the composers had they had an idea of who their audience was, and you had the editor could usually see a different and almost better audience.
Yes. So I have to assume some of you have seen Dear Evan Hansen, so we're not starting.
Oh, I didn't even ask that. How many of you have seen Dear Evan Hansen? All right.
Thank you. Thank you. It's coming to Syracuse in the spring.
Yes.
I think the question is really for me about, and the answer for me is really about how to work with an artist to get them to tell the story, which is, same thing in journalism, being an editor of a magazine or a newspaper, or
and being the editor, being the producer, you want to, as the editor, it's not your story. And as the producer, it's not your story. But your job is to make sure the story comes out in a way that will be successful. And your primary motive and the reason to become a producer or an editor, for instance, is to be able to choose the stories. So in a way, you can shape your own narrative by choosing the stories you tell. And I think that there is a special way to talk to writers and actors and composers and directors that helps get the story across. I mean, when I was an editor at Town and Country, we used to have this lunchroom where we would go and complain about some of the awful stories we'd get that we'd have to rewrite under somebody else's byline. And there are some stories that are like that, they just are, and some writers just didn't work even though you hired them, and one way or another it's got to be published or killed, and it's hard to kill a story. But giving the writer ownership and engaging them in a conversation that can foster the story is so important in the job, and that is important in journalism and in producing. It's not only important, but it's time consuming. I mean, it takes years to write an original story like Dear Evan Hansen, and there's constant conversation, constant nurturing, I think, that has to go on to finally get the story. And just as it is in journalism, where often pieces have to be revised several times before publication, a show's revisions only happen after the audience sees it, and only after you have a work session, and then a reading, and then an out-of-town performance at a smaller theater before you go to the kind of really scary bright lights of Broadway.
You've done a lot of, prior to Evan Hansen, you did a lot of adaptations of novels, movies. So what is that special thing that you can see in a story that you think is going to make it a successful, or take even success out of it, you would hope is going to be successful, but what do you see in it that makes you think this can be on stage?
Well, I had the luxury of theater producing being my second career. And so the luxury was that I had already succeeded in one career, and I was not scared of failure. I didn't want to fail, and failure in theater is expensive and gruesome, and affects a lot of people who cry. But I wasn't scared of it, and so I was choosing pieces in the beginning that moved me, or that fulfilled. I'm a voracious reader. I just love stories in general, but especially, I produced a play called The Heiress that I just loved, and I was for a long time choosing things that just moved me with the hope that it would move others. That's not always the most successful thing to do, though. And with Dear Evan Hansen, what happened, first of all, it was an original story. It didn't exist until I hired the writers and we started talking about ideas. But what I had learned with some of the failures I'd had was that in order for a theater piece to succeed, because in magazines or newspapers, it's about how many readers you have. In theater, it's about putting those butts in those seats every night. And even just a blizzard could wipe you out. A pandemic could wipe you out. You have to, the way you survive is by keeping somebody sitting in that seat every single night. And you run out of people if you don't have something universal. So with Dear Evan Hansen, I think that there was a beautiful coming together of a lot of factors. One was that the composers and writer, Vange Passig, Justin Paul, and Stephen Levinson, were in their 20s when I met them. I was in my 40s. And so already we had a multi-generational outlook, going into the show. they had the ideas about a boy who told lies and another boy who killed himself. And I mean, it sounds terrible when I say it, but it did work. But I was the one who said, if there's a boy, there has to be a mother. And then I'm interested. And then everybody like me is interested. But everybody young is interested because of the boy, especially if the boy is Ben Platt. And so what I had learned through some failures that I loved my failures, but I learned from them, is that you need to do a musical that is for everybody. And that's not so easy to do. We used to say about Dear Evan Hansen that if you are a parent or if you are a child, then this show is for you. And that is everyone in the world is either a parent or a child. So, that was sort of the secret sauce, that we had 2 generations coming to see the show. Sometimes kids would come and say to their parents, you have to see this, or vice versa, and talking about it with each other. And the word of mouth was incredible.
And in the ways you talked about some of your shows that had not been as successful. And journalism is a rejection business, and we talk about that a lot, about how to take rejection, how to take critique. With theater, that often happens in a very public way. So can you share with us how you developed the ability to take some of that rejection and criticism and move past it, or learn from it and move past it?
I didn't. I still go in the bathroom and shut the door and cry for some of my shows. Again, I think it has to do with this being my second career and having my children. This was just gravy in some ways, and so I think for me the answer to that was I don't care as much at this moment about it because I already did this, and so let's see what can happen. That, of course, didn't last very long because then I started caring about it terribly. I don't know. I'm not a person who gives up. I think a lot of producers, have gotten to that point where you understand that things fail. Very few musicals make it. I think when I first started, I was interviewing entertainment lawyers, and I think my lawyer told me that 1 out of every 5 musicals runs for 2 years. And then of course there are these amazing breakthroughs every generation. For me, it was Chorus Line. I think I've mentioned several times today. I saw it about 28 times. It was my Hamilton, Wicked, Hamilton. So there are things that break through, and then you examine them and you look at why. Why is this something that stays and that people want to see? Why did Phantom of the Opera close? After all these years, it was just announced this week, after 30 years, it was going to close. My wedding song came from Phantom of the Opera. Well, one of the reasons may be that, the pandemic stopped tourists coming to New York and tourists see Phantom, but it also may be that the new crop of musicals, like Six, have you all heard of Six? I bet you have. It's really hip, right? And so, listen to Six and listen to Phantom. Phantom feels a little dusty. Doesn't mean that I don't love it, that I wouldn't see it again before it leaves in February. But it will have its time again. A story with really good bones is a story that lasts.
Was there a moment for you with Dear Evan Hansen in particular when you just knew? I'm thinking about in my own career. There's been times when I've done interviews, and I just hear the quote, and I know it's going to be the pull quote in the story, and I'm like, this is fantastic. And so, was there a moment for you with that show that you knew before anyone else knew, that you knew you had it? You had a really magical piece of art.
There were so many, and then there were, of course, those moments where I thought it was all going to fall apart. But I would say the first one was when I met Minj and Justin, and they were just oozing with talent, and I just wanted to do whatever they wanted to do and help it happen because it felt exciting to me. It felt like I could add a story to the world that would mean something to people. And And then I think the next moment was when I heard Waving Through a Window for the first time, not sung by Ben Platt, but sung by the composers. And there was something so, exciting, but also prescient. I mean, 5 or 6 years later, there we all were in isolation, waving through the windows to each other. It was our only way of communicating, and to me, that was what the show was about. So that was very exciting. And then, there's nothing ever that beats standing in the back of a theater when your show is running and watching at the finale and looking at every single face. I used to literally keep count. If there was someone who wasn't crying, I didn't like that person. But like seeing that everyone was crying, men, women, young, old, because something about the show moved them. And that happened from the first performance.
And you recently wrote a piece for American Theater about the closing of the show, and you talked about how so much of the show was a difficult pitch because you have social media to an audience that is not necessarily social media savvy. You have youth suicide, mental health issues, like none of this screams hit. So what was it about it that, and at that time you couldn't even know how prescient it was. So what do you think it was that kind of, and it was also so long, it was just so long before that stuff really got a hold of us, I think, as a culture. So in some ways it was luck, as you've said, but also that idea had to be foreign to you in some ways, that those would be big themes. So what made you not scared to go to take those things on?
Oh, there are two things. Number one was the easy part, the music. It was just great. It was great. And we had, I worked with some fantastic digital marketers, and I used to say to them, what can we do that no one else has ever done before? I was very struck by a marketing gimmick that a show called Next to Normal did. They tweeted out the script line by line, and it really caught fire. And so I wanted to just, do something bold, like every week. So we did a bunch of things like that, but we teased a song, like I hear Beyonce does this, but I'm not so into contemporary music, but we teased a song and we dropped it at midnight, and right before we released our album. It was a solo with Ben Platt and Laura Dreyfus called Only Us. And we said to our followers, which we had the second largest following very quickly after Hamilton of any show on Broadway. At this moment, I think we have around 500,000 followers on Instagram alone. And we said, we're only gonna let you listen to this song for 24 hours, and then it's gone. And but you are our super fans, so you get to hear it. And first we tweeted it out to like 100 super fans who went crazy on social media, but not just your normal super fans. We had some outreach. We tweeted it to Anna Kendrick, who had, I don't even know how many followers, but a lot. But then we also tweeted it to a 13-year-old girl in, Boise, Idaho, who wrote to us a lot. And they talked to each other online. These people, it just became a sensation that we did this. My favorite comment from this whole experience was somebody wrote that they were going to sue Google because for some reason the email that they got alerting them that the song was coming their way was like in their spam. That people were just like going crazy for the music. So number one was the music. But number two goes back to, journalism. A good story is a good story. And this story was a good story. It made people talk, it made people angry. The ending infuriated certain people. But it was authentic. It felt like our contemporary life. The things that people say in the show are things that come out naturally out of our mouths. And there were only 8 characters, if you don't count social media as the 9th character, and each one of them was very relatable. They were the mothers that you have and the kids that you went to school with and the kid who threw the printer at Mrs. G in second grade. It's the one from the show. But they're like people that you know.
And you, as part of the you and the team that behind the show, have done a lot of outreach with nonprofits and become really part of the national conversation about mental health. And that seemed new for you in terms of theater. So how do you think? Can you tell us a little bit about some of those relationships and what they've meant to you as a producer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other similarity between producing and being a journalist is you have to be ready for the next question, the next thing that happens, and a story can be a living, breathing organism. You write a story for a newspaper, you might have to do a follow-up story because the story unfolds. Well, our story unfolded in a very peculiar way with Dear Evan Hansen. So let me just say right now, if you have seen the film, let's just put that aside for a minute because the plot is different. The film was unsuccessful, and the film did something that we maintained we would never do in the show. The film diagnosed Evan. We, as the writers and I, were very, very clear from very early on that giving Evan a mental health illness that was, very clear cut, eliminated a lot of people from the conversation. Letting it be generic and wondering what he has. Does he have anxiety? Is he depressed? Is he a little of both? Or is he just a little nerdy and lonely like a lot of us and having a difficult time in his life with an annoying single mom and trying to, fit in? Sometimes it's not easy to fit in. Your first day of freshman year, is it easy to fit in? So the beauty of him being undiagnosed meant that everyone could relate to Evan. I had people coming up to me on the street and saying, I was thrown into the garbage pail in junior high school and lunch. I'm Evan Hansen. Very important people were saying that to me. At the same time, the beauty of that also was that the audience diagnosed Evan as to what their own kids had or what they had. So if you were anxious, you were Evan. If you had Asperger's, then you decided that Evan had Asperger's. If your nephew had OCD, then Evan had OCD. And if you were lonely, then you were Evan, or any of the other characters. And so that was interesting because we started, lots of famous people started coming to see the show. Writers came to see the show. The press started taking the narrative out of my hands. I had controlled it for years until we got on the world stage. And we became, in some ways, the mental health show. And I thought that was going to be bad, but when you balance that with the Grammy and the fact that they're playing your music on the radio all the time, we somehow find a niche in popular culture, which is what we did. But we also had to pivot because we were a rabid fan favorite. As I said, we had many, many followers on social media. And kids, but also adults, were writing to us saying, telling us words from, the show that explained their lives. There was a woman in the audience who has it tattooed on her ankle. Today you're you, that's enough. You matter, you have been found, you are not alone. It struck in popular culture at a moment when people seemed to really need it. And so a lot of what we heard from the general public was amazing and instilled confidence in us. And some of it was really scary because when you put yourself out there, you hear from people who are sad. And so we got, DMs, letters at the stage door. The actors were contacted from people who were unhappy with their lives and used the euphemism from the show of letting go of the tree, which meant they were going to, commit suicide, and write to us. And so we had to rally. We partnered with 5, in the end it was 6 not-for-profit mental health organizations. We worked with them, we let them use our show to raise awareness for their issues. And we did speeches together, we did events together, but most important, we have a psychiatrist to this day on board of our show who trains our actors what to do if someone comes to you at the stage door and says something like that, and who helps in the middle of the night when someone tweets at us that says, you know, this is what I'm going to do now. And it became a responsibility that we never dreamed of when we wanted to put on a real show. And we were scared it would be the kind of thing that would kill us. But instead, I think it fueled us on, especially with the pandemic.
I know our audience has many questions that are, I'm sure, deep in the deep cuts of Dear Evan Hansen. So I just have a couple more, and then I'll turn the mic over. So we're in a post-COVID, quote unquote, ish Broadway environment. So what does that look like to you now from the inside? And what do you think it's going to mean for the future of Broadway?
In terms of COVID itself, or other pandemics or things like that.
I'm sure there's another one coming. Sorry, everybody. Like we have, for example, so we have things here that practices that we did during COVID. I certainly did things in my classroom differently, and some of them I've kept. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, what do you think COVID will change about Broadway besides the economic piece?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that Broadway's come out of COVID yet. My show was dark for 2 years. Most shows were dark somewhere between 15 months and 2 years. It just depended on when they decided to reopen. I was terrified to reopen. I told the Broadway League, my show can be the last show that reopens. I want to watch everyone do it first, because no one understood how to, you could come to work in masks if you're in an office building. You can't come to work in masks if the script calls for you to kiss someone or to sing. And so it was very frightening. I think now most shows and producers understand how to keep their company as safe as possible. But as you've all seen, I'm sure in your lives, that COVID kind of trickles in. We reopened in 21 on somewhere around December 4th, and a week later we closed for a week because every single actor in my company got COVID all at the same time after being careful. Even though I refused to throw a reopening party so there'd be no infection or whatever. But I was lucky. I was actually one of the luckier producers because my company got it all at the same time and we were done. And then we didn't have to close again due to COVID. In the beginning, everybody was, opening and closing, and it was instilling in the audience who pays for these tickets and would get to the theater, sit in their seats even, and find out that the understudy for the understudy for the understudy was also sick. So I don't know, every show is different, but I had the luxury of having an 8-person show. We called back every understudy we'd ever had in, it was more than 6 years between the out-of-town engagements and all that. We asked everyone, if we needed you, would you be able to come back? We sent them all their rehearsal books again. We had the costume department pull all their costumes. We have, we were one of the only shows that did this. We gave people stipends to keep them free when we were getting scared that someone would get sick. We sent an actress from New York to London because all the London moms in the show were sick at the same time. It takes an incredible amount of energy, perseverance, wit to stay alive during COVID, and that's just backstage. Then you've got people who don't want to wear a mask, people who do want to wear a mask, people who want to eat in theater but sitting next to somebody who wants a mask on. It's just been a difficult time. And I don't know that we're really out of it yet, not to mention that most of Broadway houses are filled with tourists. And while domestic tourism is back in New York somewhat, it's not back fully. And when the school year starts, everybody goes back to school or back to their cities, and not necessarily to New York. The tri-state area, the people who care about Broadway in the tri-state area had already seen my show, probably twice, and so didn't really need to come again. So you're constantly struggling for an audience in a way that Every show struggles for an audience anyway, but now there are 10 more reasons to struggle. It's still very difficult.
And to turn our attention back locally a little bit, so when you think about your time here at Newhouse and time here at Syracuse University, what still resonates with you with the life that you have now?
Well, I've been thinking about that a lot lately since I knew I was coming back, and I think I was really happy here. I was just telling the features editor of your Daily Orange, I was the features editor of the Daily Orange, that I thought that was one of the best jobs I ever had. Because you could just write whatever you want, assign yourself anything. I mean, when do you ever get to do that? And then you can even like suggest, gee, I think this is a front page story. It was just fantastic. But I think here at Newhouse, I really, really learned to love words, to love telling stories, to love listening to stories, to love helping others tell their stories, and like the things that my professor said to me, I still think about all the time. I mean, I still say these things to people.
So now it is time for questions from the audience. What are you going to do with that, our mic situation?
You can keep the mic, and whoever's asking the question, if you can just stand up and really project so everyone can
So
hear
you
you.
don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Anybody have a question? Yes, first person who raised their hand. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Stacey. I'm Sarah. I'm an MD senior. I guess my question is, did you use any connections in your career as a journalist that kind of helped you enter into the theater scene?
Connections from journalism to theater?
Yeah, so how did you use your network that maybe, if that actually helped you, start as a theater producer?
In a roundabout way, I did, because sadly for my show's press team, I used to constantly start every meeting with them by saying, well, look, I was a journalist, so here's how I think we should do this. I think I might have been particularly helpful crafting the show's marketing and press narrative, because I had been a journalist and I understood how to feed journalists what they want. But I used a lot of my journalism connections to get a lot of jobs in journalism, but not in theater.
And you said some of those came from Newhouse, right?
Pretty much all of them came from Newhouse.
Thank you.
Other questions? A room full of journalists with no questions? I don't believe that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm sorry, I have all kinds of stuff here. I would stand up. My name is Michelle. Thank you for being here today. My question is, how do you pitch to someone like you if you have a story? Where does that entry point? Do you need an agent, or is it something that you can do through your contacts and networking? And can someone send you an idea?
It's a hard question to answer because there are a million ways that things reach you. People send things to my website. Agents call me all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. Agents, I hope this is okay to say, I'm probably going to get in trouble, but agents aren't always that nice, so you don't always pick up the phone to talk to them. So it may not be the right answer if you're a writer to have your agent pitch it. I have to believe, and I do believe, that a really good story finds its place one way or another, and I would suggest that you try everything and never give up if you really believe in it. Send it out, try to use connections. Can't hurt to have an agent who can guide you or introduce you to people. I don't think there's any one way.
Yes, Syracuse t-shirt.
Hi, I'm Jackson. I worked on a production of King John this summer, and so I saw seeing the producer and the creative director and the actors, kind of all work in conjunction with each other. For you as a producer, how do you kind of facilitate that, and I don't know, what kind of language works best for you, communicating with others on set?
Well, every producer is different, and every show is different. And because the story is different, it requires just a different set of workers or artists and a different set of skills from a producer. So it depends on the show in a lot of ways. First of all, the producer hires everybody. literally. So they all work for you. But that's not always a good thing in terms of communication. I always say this, and I'm not sure it's the right answer, but I'm a mom of 3 sons, and I always liked there being a nurturing environment. I didn't want people to feel, I mean, it's theater, it's not brain surgery. There should be joy there every day. For some reason, making theater isn't joyful every day. It's dramatic, it's hard, it's, nerve-wracking, and artists are insecure. Writers are insecure. So why does it have to be hard? We try to have it be a joyful place to come to work, both at the theater, in the creation, and all of that.
And I think it's for those of you who are looking into you have leadership roles on campus right now, or you're going into leadership, that's such an important thing to remember, that it's a leader that sets the tone for the environment, and you're creating the kind of workplace that you want to be in.
It's true, but I also always used to say I'm only as good as my team. So choosing the people, because they represent you and because they take what you started and carry it on is very important.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Selwyn. Thank you for being here. My question has to deal with the length of time that it takes to develop a project. Now, I know you mentioned it was 8 years, I believe, for this. As someone coming out of an academic, arena and excited about, starting their careers and getting things moving, how do you balance that time that it takes for certain types of projects and the patience that is required in order to continue to move on in your career, doing other things while other things develop?
Well, I think that's the answer. I mean, doing multiple things at a time. Like once Evan Hansen became a hit, I couldn't do anything else. There was nothing, it took over everything. It spawned quickly. But until it did, I produced other plays or I worked on other people's productions. I met with writers and started looking for other ideas and brought them along through readings and trying to prepare myself for what would happen after Evan Hansen. But there was no after Evan Hansen. But I think, you have to have multiple projects at a time if you want to kind of keep meeting people in the industry and being part of it and working with as many people as possible. Once you have a very, very successful show, it's hard to work on anything else because you've created a brand that you then oversee. So until you do that, it's really good to have multiple projects. I think that's one of the answers. But also, it's patience, and you might need to have a day job. You might need to do other things.
Go ahead.
Alex, I'm a broadcast major. Curious, how did you start out as a producer? Like, how was it starting, and how did writers know they could reach out to you to get the production?
Well, artists don't reach out to you until they know you. There are 2 kinds of producers, really. There's co-producers and there's lead producers. Co-producers I was a co-producer, they're amazing people who support Broadway. They go out and raise money and they become part of a producing team, but they don't make any decisions on the show. And they don't hire anybody, they don't really have contact with the artists or the actors, they have contact with the lead producer. I started by becoming a co-producer, and I would try to choose shows wisely, not just because I loved them, and sometimes in fact I didn't, but because it would give me the opportunity to work with a different set of people that I could learn from, so that I could then start working on my own ideas from learning. And I met with theater management students earlier this morning. When I was starting producing in my early 40s, there weren't a lot of options for me in New York City to take that kind of class. And I also didn't really want to manage, I wanted to create. And there really aren't a lot of ways to do that other than to have some skills and believe in a project. And then I learned as I went. So on each show as a co-producer, I tried to make myself as valuable as I could to the lead producer by using my press skills or my marketing skills, by suggesting ideas. Sometimes I would go to a meeting and say, I'm only going to say one thing, but it's going to be a good thing. And I started, just collecting people and making a name for myself, and also meeting young composers. I was on a board of something called the National Alliance of Musical Theater, where I came into contact with a lot of musical musicians and composers and young directors and writers. And then I partnered with somebody on a show that did well, and so my name started getting out there. And it's a slow build where people start knowing you, and then all of a sudden you're flooded with scripts, and most of them are crazy, and one or two of them are pretty good.
My name's Jessica. Thanks again for being here. My question to you is, what advice would you give yourself after graduating college and starting your career?
I should have expected that one. That's a good question. I think in some ways that girl could probably give me some advice right now. I'm crediting Newhouse with a lot of this, but I knew what I wanted to do. I knew how to do it. I was really, really well prepared. I had a lot of people here behind me, my professors, their alumni. I wrote every day here. That's a gift. I wrote at the Daily Orange, I wrote for class, I wrote for other publications, I wrote for myself, I wrote job applications. I knew what I wanted to do. So, I don't know, she was probably crazy, but she was also really brave. And, now, all those 36 years later, I kind of think, what do I want to do next? I could use a little advice from her, maybe you, if you have time for coffee later.
Yes.
So I'm Sophie, sorry. So I'm just interested about what you were saying about navigating that line of finding like a good story that's universal, because I know that especially with musicals lately, the prevalence of adaptations or revivals is way higher than original stories. So how do you find that balance of finding a story that you want to tell but also needing to make money, and knowing that an adaptation may be more well received because it's already familiar?
It's a great question. I don't know that an adaptation is necessarily well received because it's familiar. A lot of the adaptations haven't worked in a lot of years, and I personally am getting really bored by musicals that were movies that I loved, and then I don't love the musical, and then it ruins the movie for me. I'm much more interested in adaptations that are from a New Yorker story, or a moment in history, or something unexpected than just doing a beloved novel, or not that I didn't do that myself, but they didn't do so well. There's nothing like an original story, but those are also really hard because you have to create the bones first and then the rest of the story, whereas when you do an adaptation, the bones are there. And as far as universal, I think, in a lot of ways, the definition of that is expanding in our world today. I think we're just, we've changed so much as a culture, even since the pandemic, about what we're interested in and what kinds of stories work. And some of the weirder stories are actually very universal. Like, when Ben Platt accepted his, I'm not gonna get this right, but accepted his Tony Award, he said something about, it's really good that I'm weird. He said to young people, don't be afraid to be that. And I think that there are a lot of offbeat stories now that 10 years ago wouldn't have been deemed commercial, and now they are.
Are you still looking, I think as journalists, we kind of see the world, not looking for please send me your stories, but when you go out and you're reading things, and are you seeing stories in places?
Well, my husband asked me to take a gap year after Dear Evan Hansen, so thinking about that. But I think I've been trained to always look for a good story. Even if it's about, what I want to watch on Netflix. I spend more time with my husband debating what we're gonna watch than actually watching it, because we have different interests in what we wanna watch, but we wanna watch together, and then our kids come in, but it's all about what is a good story on Netflix, So I think about what is a good story all the time, and every time I read a novel, I'm casting it in my head. And I think that I am in a position, as a lot of producers who have had hits like Evan Hansen, where I have to figure out how I could top that, and it may have to be in a completely different medium, or it has to be something different, because I really was gifted with an experience that was quite joyful.
Way in the back.
Hi, sorry, I came a little late, so this question is repetitive. I'm sorry. But as someone who has a history in the journalism industry, do you feel like when you're producing, you're hyper aware of like the PR around a production, or do you feel like more calm, cool, that you already know what publication is thinking when you produce?
That's a great question. As I said earlier, I think that I have been helpful to my press teams in positioning the show and pitching stories, but I have been really awful in predicting the kinds of reviews that I've gotten over the course of my career. Even when I've gotten good reviews, I didn't think they were better than I thought, or when I got bad reviews, I was surprised. So I think when it's your own baby, you're just not that objective. You always think it's the best baby in the world.
I feel like I saw other hands and now they've gone away. Yes.
Hi, my name is Cassandra. I'm a first-year magazine as a digital student. And my question to you, as a obviously very successful Newhouse alumnus, how did you best utilize your time here to get to where you are today?
I was at the Daily Orange like that first week. I just, even in high school, I wanted to be a journalist, and I wanted to be a writer, and I applied here and knew that I would be at the Daily Orange the first week. I think by the end of the first semester, I was brought on as an editor. And I just wrote. I'm not embarrassed to say now that I was a little nerdy, maybe a lot. I didn't need to go out. I don't know what you guys do now, but we used to go to they used to go to M Street and drink, and I just never wanted to do any of that. I lived up in Day Hall, 110 steps above the Mount, right? And once you got up there, it was really hard to want to go down again. And so I would write, or I had a bunch of close friends who were writers and journalists today even, and so I was very not career-minded, but writing-minded. I told the class we were just in, I don't remember having dinner, like Monday through Thursday in Syracuse, because I was at the DL every night. So I'm not sure if that was the best idea, but I just kind of got into it right away.
We have time for one more closing question. Yes.
I'm Danny, by the way. Kind of piggybacking off what we were talking about before, has there ever been a story or something you've seen that you loved, but you knew it was just too crazy, too outlandish, and that it wasn't gonna fly or get traction, you had to axe it?
I had a bunch of those. There's one particular story that I loved, that I got very far along with. And it was based on an NPR, All Things Considered radio show. And I found the people and convinced them to give me the rights to tell the story in music. And I went through some composer. It wasn't. When I think about Evan Hansen, it was easy. We all fit pretty quickly together. There was chemistry. It took a while to get the chemistry. I definitely had the right director, but I wasn't sure I had the right team. And in the process of putting it all together, the person whose life story I was going to tell through this musical got cold feet and pulled out. So I didn't kill it myself. It might have been a blessing. Maybe I wouldn't have killed it and I would have had, a big failure on my hands. I don't think so though. It was a great story. Can't tell you because maybe there'll be something to do.
I just want to thank you, Stacey, so much for joining us today, and thank you all for coming out. All right, have a great weekend, everybody. Be careful out there.